Good afternoon, class. I thought I'd pick up in thinking a little more about what we were able to accomplish and not accomplish in class this morning. I decided I wanted to put up a few more comments to get us a little bit deeper into the content that we have this week. And as you'll note here, our big theme, if we have one word that we'll be looking at this week, it's going to be ecology. And we spent some time talking about this term and trying to define it. I did a little overview of the three schools of ecology that we'll be spending a little bit of time with this week. And then we closed talking about some ecological relationships, kind of came to us via the example of bald eagles along the Anacostia River near Washington, D.C., which is maybe a hopeful thought to think that there are intact and rather healthy bald eagle populations, even in an area so populated and dense and congested as our nation's capital. So anyway, we'll move on from here, and I want to get back to talking. I'm just going to take on that first school of ecology, the human ecologists, and then we'll call it good for today. So just a little bit about the history of the term. Your textbook talks a little bit about ecology and where it comes from. But the term, the root, oikos, is the Greek term for household or home. And so it's probably maybe a little comforting root to think that the scientific study of the relationships between organisms is traceable back to that idea of home. And it suggests probably that our natural environment is, fittingly, the home in which even our civilized societies function. It becomes, the term starts to establish its holding power and significance in the sort of mid to late 1800s, and that's perhaps not surprising because we know that industrialization is proceeding at a rather rapid clip at that point in world history and American history. And in 1866, this gentleman, a German by the name of Ernst Haeckel, puts forth the idea of oikology, or ecology. And it's, he's really among the first to, at least in a popular sense, or to bring it something closer to mainstream, to recognize that there needs to be a field within science that talks about the relationships of organisms. We think of, in science even today, the tendency is for people to find a area of expertise and singular understanding. I'm brought to mind of my sister-in-law who 5 years ago completed her her dissertation, her PhD, on, it was a wildlife biology focus that she had, but on a very specific aspect, a moth in Yellowstone National Park that in given years provides local grizzly bear populations. It's an alternative form of nourishment or trophic level in the grizzly bear food chain, particularly when other forms of nourishment are lacking. But anyway, that gives you a sense of the sort of focused and narrow area that many biology and life sciences come to rest upon. But here in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, we see a recognition that there needs to be an emphasis upon the relationships that exist between organisms, and that could be a valid and useful understanding for scientists to have. And so this is really where we start to see a singular focus on relationships. In one way to think about this is things that stretch across the species of the natural environment, as opposed to focusing on the singular experience of one species within an ecosystem or the natural environment. So very soon this discipline is going to start, as is often the case, once it gets its start, it will evolve rather quickly. And just a few years after ecology is introduced as a field of study, it takes on this notion of not only is it ecology, but also economy. Both terms, of course, originate from that root of household. But in the one case, it's the study of the household. And in the other case, in the case of economy, it's the management of the household. So understanding how a household, in this case an ecosystem, fit together, both in terms of how the different species rely and relate to one another, but also on how the whole household is sort of managed or successful or unsuccessful based on the proper relationships that exist within it. So we start to see very early some changes, some important and useful changes in the understanding of this term ecology. And so these interrelations are really important. And by 1873 we have a clear sense of ecology, but now we can add to it. If we reach back just a little bit earlier in the 1800s, in 1860, this is the year that Darwin famously releases his groundbreaking work, Origin of Species. And in that groundbreaking work is his theory of natural selection. And that, of course, becomes the mechanism that explains the already established principle of evolution. So people were aware of natural evolution before 1860, but what Darwin's contribution is the specific theory by which evolution takes place, which is this notion of natural selection. What this means for ecology is that by 1873, we now start to think, scientists are thinking of ecology with that added layer of natural selection and how different species are engaged in a competition, and that this competition becomes sort of the singular metaphor for the relationships that exist within an ecosystem or the natural environment. Now I just want to stop there. It's interesting, you know, we can even bring Cronin into this conversation here, I think, and say that, you know, using competition or you know, sort of the Darwinian struggle of survival of the fittest, that's a parable, right? I mean, that's a story, that's a narrative that suggests how nature works. And it's true, if we look at nature, we can certainly find examples of how organisms are competing for advantage and competing to have their genes propagated and to succeed relative to both other members of their own species, and then perhaps such that their species will prevail at the expense of other species beyond them. But if you rise up, if you take that just a few levels up and maybe go a little higher into the sky and look down on planet Earth, you can also notice that it could also be a useful metaphor to talk about the cooperation and the symbiotic relationships that exist between different species. I mean, a forest is a good example. You could characterize that as a struggle, right? Trees are competing to grow taller so they can capture more of the sunlight at the expense of their neighboring trees. But you can also find countless examples of collaboration and cooperation in which, you know, the death of some trees and the decomposition and nutrients that are returned to the soil ultimately become the nourishment of the next generation. Obviously, we have trees and vegetation that provide the habitat and nesting and nourishment for other species. So I just wanted to stop there or just pause there and indicate that this whole idea of nature as this Darwinian contest of competition is perhaps overblown a bit, and we can sometimes think of that parable or narrative being the lens through which we see the natural environment around us. Although if we change the channel or change our paradigm, the structure or narrative lens through which we view things, we could probably also see quite quite a few examples of cooperation and collaboration in a typical ecosystem. Okay, so we see this notion of ecology, particularly in the final decades of the late 19th century, really grabbing hold. And that brings us to our first school of ecology. We'll call these the Human Ecologists. And there's an interesting history behind this, and it's one that I think Emergence application of race, class, and gender, interestingly here, and I say it's interesting just because it's remarkable that America's awareness, the United States awareness of ecology, interestingly comes to us via a female scientist. And what makes that interesting is that science, certainly if you think science today is largely the purview or domain of men, which is in some ways true, although I think we're seeing increasingly more women entering various fields of science, but there's still that perception, right, that young girls and young women need to be encouraged to enter into the professions of science because there is something of a perception that the odds are stacked against them being welcomed into such a field. Well, that reality was far, far more pronounced back in the late 1800s. And so Ellen Swallow Richards becomes a really interesting case study in a woman who, in her passion and pursuit of science, not only becomes an important scientist in her own right, but she also brings a consciousness and awareness and even a discipline of science to the United States and really starts to bring it mainstream. So we credit her with taking the term and concepts that Ernst Haeckel first introduced into Germany and bringing them to the United States. And it's worth noting that during Ellen Swallow Richards' time as a young emerging scientist, someone who was curious about things like chemistry and air quality and water quality, there weren't many opportunities available to her. In particular, in the 1860s, there really was just baccalaureate education for women in the United States. And what that means is that there was just undergraduate schools and programs available to them. And that fails to even account for the fact that very few women would have even been eligible to get into a four-year institution in her day. In fact, I mean, you could, it's even a difficult prospect today for young men and women. By and large, a majority of Americans do not have a college degree. Back then, of course, far more the case. Nonetheless, Ellen Swallow Richards went as far as her education would take her, but there weren't institutions for higher, graduate or doctoral level work for women at her time. She, as a young adult woman, goes to Germany to see what she might be able to pursue in the way of furthering her scientific knowledge and understanding. And this is where she comes into contact with the German tradition begun by Ernst Haeckel of this notion of ecology. She returns to the United States after these important travels. She, through a series of fortuitous developments, she begins a stint as a scientist at MIT in the 1870s. There was a special laboratory that was established there with funding from a women's group, which allowed her a really unusual and valuable opportunity to start and resume her scientific studies. In 1892, decades later, she is going to be the first to introduce ecology to the United States in an address that she provides to fellow scientists. And by this point, she has begun to establish a reputation for herself. Now, our real emphasis here is